Hey everyone, Voodoo here, and today we're back with the Melee tier list for Season 4 of Shadowlands. We're going to be doing both Mythic Plus and Raid, starting with Mythic Plus, of course. Before we get into it, I just want to say that, of course, this tier list is just for the mid to higher tier of keys, so plus 20s, plus 27s, that range kind of deal. Not like the highest key pushers, and also not like the highest top 100 world guilds. This is just kind of your generic higher end player Mythic M plus tier list, and of course everything is viable. You can and should and will do everything on any character or class that you want to. This is just kind of an idea in a vacuum. We'll get right into it. We're going to start with Mythic Plus here. So Mythic Plus, the first one we're going to start with is my boy Arms. Arms going to put in B tier. Arms has some ability to do burst with Blade Storm followed into Merciless Bone Grinder. However, of course, their burst isn't as consistent, it isn't as large, and it does have some downfalls that the classes above it don't. Arms bring some decent utility with Shout, both Shouts. They have some stuns, they have some stops. Overall, they're kind of slow. They're not that survivable. Their only defensive really is Die by the Sword, and their AoE damage, while good, has some lacking. There's only so much damage you can do with the Blade Storm Whirlwind combo. Their single target is also lacking a little bit, so we'll put them in B, but they're still definitely a solid choice. Enhancement Shaman, I'm going to put up an A. Now, this might be a bit of a surprise pick, but I've been doing a bunch of keys recently, and Enhancement Shamans I've seen have been just kind of pumping. I think they actually do belong in A. They bring Wind Fury, which is not that big of a deal in AoE, but they also bring the ability, they bring Sundering, which can stop, they bring Cap Totem, which can stop, they have a Hex, they have the best kick in the game with shortest cooldown and longest yards. They also bring fairly strong single target and pretty strong AoE. In terms of spreading Flame Shock and using the thing that kind of makes Flame Shock explode. So I think that Enhancement Shaman definitely deserves an A. You could argue this one drops down to B, but I think A is pretty good. I've seen good numbers from these things. Feral Druid, D. Feral doesn't really bring anything. Cyber Slack got their tier set nerfed, so now Feral doesn't really have any way of doing AoE. Single target's great, but of course there's like 4 times where you really need that. On Tyrannical, they bump up a little bit, but they're just AoE is so bad that I just don't think they deserve higher than a D. Sorry, Ferals. Frost is next. Now, Frost, you really could argue, could go in B or C. I'm going to put them in B. I think the fact that they lost out on really means that they don't have breath up as often, and that really definitely reduces their overall utility and throughput and just ability to do damage in a dungeon. They do suffer from a lot of things that their DKs have. They do have a grip, they have a slow, or a stun. Other than that, they don't have a lot of utility. They do bring AMZ, which can be useful in dungeons. But because of the real nerfs, the fact that they're just being not able to do as much damage as they were before because they have breath less often, they do drop down to B tier. Fairy Warrior, we're going to put an A above Enhancement Shaman. Fairy has a very strong burst every minute or so, 45 seconds or so with Spear. With their tier set, they have a lot of Recklessness uptime. So they have very strong burst there. They're very survivable, I would say more so than Arms. In Radiant Regeneration is on like a 1-minute cooldown, which is very strong, and they naturally have higher stamina because of two-handers that they're using. So I think that is a very good thing for them there. Their damage is quite good. It is capped. They can't go really that much higher than their Blade Storm targets or their Whirlwind. Whirlwind only hitting, I believe it's 3 other things, but it could be 4. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a warrior. But their AoE damage is capped there, which is kind of stopping them from being an S tier. But they're quite good in AoE. You really, you're not going to do too bad picking one up, and they're, I think they're A tier. Next, Havoc. Havoc, you could argue is A, you could argue is B. I'm going to put it in B personally. Havoc's big issue is the same as I've outlined many times. I'm a Havoc main, right? Their only real big AoE comes from either Feldev, which isn't even that big, or meta. The only time you can really do those big numbers that stuff like Fire Mage or Destrolock or Serve Hunter are doing is if there's a ton of targets that you meta onto and nobody else is doing anything so that you have time for Brand to tick on them. Other than that, Havoc's AoE is really restricted to how high it can get. You do have pretty good pack-to-pack burst with with Brand into I-Beam into Death Sweep. But other than that, your AoE damage isn't that high. And I don't think they really deserve to be higher. They do bring good single target focus, and they bring the magic debuff for your Fire Mages or your Destrolocks or your Serve Hunters. But overall, I do think B is a better place for them to sit in. They just don't bring some of the ability to do damage that upper tiers do. Of course, you could see it in A because they do have that ability to kind of do some crazy numbers, but it's not that common. and just because of other classes in the game, it's not that realized. Next is Outlaw, and our first S tier. This is actually a very interesting season where we have multiple classes that can fit in the S tier role. Outlaw, for a while, for I think most of this expansion, has been pretty bad. In BFA, it was crazy. There were multiple times where you'd run multiple Outlaws, and Outlaw was just crazy. But in BFA, in Shadowlands, they capped a lot of stuff. They nerfed it to the ground, and it just wasn't good. But recently, they've done a lot of buffs, both to Blade Flurry's damage and just the overall damage of Outlaw. Their tier set's pretty fun. The Legendary causes them to kind of proc a bunch of gunshots, which then lets them do a big between the eyes, and you can cleave all of that. Outlaw really just does crazy amounts of damage to the targets they can hit with Blade Flurry, which I believe is 5 targets. They don't go any higher than that with their AoE, but the damage they do to those 5 targets is so ridiculously high that they definitely deserve to be an S tier. They are a crazy, crazy damage dealer and are incredibly strong right now. Alright, next up is Ret Paladin. Ret I'm going to throw in C. Ret does have the ability to do some AoE damage with their Wake of Ash resets, with their Legendary that shoots out Templar's Verdicts, and with their ability to kind of explode with Holy Light during their wings. However, again, their damage just really isn't there compared to some of the higher classes. Yes, some of it can be uncapped, but a lot of it's RNG'd, how much you can do with Wake of Ashes. Their wings cooldown is at 2 minutes, kind of hard stuck there. Can't really reduce that. And they're very immobile and squishy, and really their only big benefit to keys, yes, they have the 3% damage reduction, but they have like a stun, and Repentance isn't really useful in a lot of places. They have a slow that's not really that useful. I guess Consecration can do some damage, but really Ret's utility suite is fine. Its damage is alright, but really you're going to lose out on either the big AoE or single target depending on what build you're doing. So I do think C is a good place for them. They're fairly inflexible, and I think they're just kind of deserve to be there. Next, Ass. Ass goes in D. Ass is Ass. It just can't really... It's a dot-based class. It can't really do anything in M+, currently. It has no real way of applying its dots easily in AoE. Single target's fine, but you don't really need that single target when, you know, a lot of the trash in these dungeons are bad. The bosses are also pretty bad, but realistically, Ass just doesn't bring enough to outweigh any of the other classes, especially with any good rogue currently playing Outlaw, which will bring the value of Ass a little bit lower comparatively, right? But, yeah, I just don't think that they really have a place in this season. Of course, you know, if you want to play Ass, they're fine, go ahead. But I think Outlaw is probably the better rogue and will be seen a lot more. I think the same is true for Sub, actually. I don't think Sub really has just the ability to perform where Outlaw does currently. Yes, they have strong funnel. They do have decent enough AoE, but it's just nowhere near what Outlaw can be doing right now. I don't know, they're just nowhere near as good. The fact that any good rogue player right now is playing Outlaw definitely pushes Sub down towards the bottom comparatively as well. I think the class itself could probably go up to C, but because everyone's playing Outlaw right now, and Sub's AoE was definitely gimped a little bit, I definitely think D tier is where it's at for them. Survival, up in S tier. They nerfed Survival again recently. They gave it another nerf to its tier set, but then they gave it a massive single target buff where they buff like all of its single target abilities. I still think Survival is going to be fine. They're definitely going to be more of a choice now about what you bring in the S tier, but the fact that Survival got nerfed, it's still going to be fine. Still does really high bomb damage. You have bombs all the time, so you have burst every pack. You have really high Kyrian damage. You bring the crit buff. Your cooldown is up fairly often. Like, Survival is a really good kit, and now they actually bring crazy, crazy high single target damage because of all these buffs they've gotten to compensate for the bomb nerfs. So I think Survival's gonna be fine. They're in S tier for sure. Unholy, down in D. Unholy doesn't really bring a lot that other classes do. They're kind of a setup class in AoE. Gone are the days of BFA where they can just do this crazy, crazy uncapped scaling damage quadratically up to like above 20 targets or whatever. So they just don't really have that niche. They require setup, which is never great for M+, especially with a lot of the bursty classes that are going on in S tier. And they're a dot-based class, which really just dot-based classes don't really have that big of a benefit right now in M+, unless your dot hits like a truck. Last, Windwalker. Windwalker is definitely up in S tier as well. Windwalker is doing crazy, crazy AoE damage. All you gotta do is spin the wind, baby. They have decent enough single target now that they're not a liability on bosses because of the buffs they've been given. The 5% and minor other nerfs to spinning crank kick isn't that big of a deal. and they will continue to be a very strong M+ pick, and they're fun if you enjoy a Windwalker alternating buttons or just spinning. So those are my M+ guesses, I would say, or predictions. Next, we're going to move on to the raid portion. So raid is a little bit more interesting because in comparison to M+, where there's only these 8 dungeons, we've already seen all the dungeons. As the time of making this, only Castle Nathir has come out, so a lot of these opinions could potentially change based on bosses in future raids, because we have 3 that we're rotating through. However, I'll try and keep it fairly generic here so that the stuff I'm saying sticks around and is applicable for different raids and different bosses and such. Alright, so first we're going to give them arms. Now, arms is currently performing very well in Castle Nathir. There's lots of bosses where Sweeping Strikes is very good, and a lot of their single target buffs have come through. A lot of other bosses, though, they are performing quite bad. They're down very low in Council or Sludge. I think it's Council. They're down very low in Council, which definitely moves them down. But they're up in a lot of other bosses. Arms, I would give either A or B at. Now, this is very dependent on what raid you're in. I believe in Castle Nathir, it's an A to an S on certain bosses. In Sepultura, it's less good. But I think we're going to average it in A. Arms does bring very strong single target now with all the buffs they've gotten. They do bring incredibly strong 2-target cleave. That is their Giga niche with Sweeping Strikes. They bring Warrior Shout. They bring the other Warrior Shout, the attack power one. Die with a Sword is much more useful in raids, I would say. And they do bring a Mortal Strike effect, which is quite useful on a number of bosses. So I do think A tier is fair there. Now, again, this can definitely be moved down to B. But again, that's not that big of a deal. It's definitely on the precipice of both of them. I'm going to give them A because I'm a little generous today. Next, we're going to do Enhancement Shaman. So Enhancement in Raid is very one note, which I think is their big downfall. They can do a lot of single target damage if their procs are lucky with Hot Hands and all that stuff. However, outside of that, because of the build they're running, they don't really have a lot of that other ability to flex into cleave or flex into stuff like that. So I think B tier is fair for Enhancement Shaman. They can do crazy good damage if the opportunities or the procs line up, but they're otherwise pretty one note. You're going to bring some. Wind Fury is crazy strong, especially in conjugation with arms or other melee classes, but I don't think their numbers alone warrant them a higher spot. Next is Feral. Beep boop. Feral, great single target, nothing else. A lot of good players aren't playing Feral, which will put its representation and performance lower. Really, it's Feral. I'm really hoping something comes through for this class in Dragonflight, although it's not looking like it because their tree hasn't been touched in a long time. But really, Feral deserves to shine for once, and it just hasn't been able to yet. So, pouring out for Feral. We're all hoping for it, but down in D it goes. Next is Frost. Now, Frost's niche is Cleave. Cleave or AoE. So there's not a lot of that in Raid, so down in C it goes. Its single target just isn't really there. It can be fun to play, and if there's any for a boss where Breath of Sindragosa lines up incredibly well with ad waves, or lines up incredibly well with just having perma cleave, like on Lord's Dread, then Frost can do good and can be bumped up to B in those scenarios. But because there's not a lot of those bosses, I'm going to give them a C just generically. I still think it's a good enough class. I think DK damaging is good overall, especially if you're able to flex between the 2 different specs. But Frost itself, because of its downfalls and because a lot of the bosses just don't really play into its strengths, gets a C. Fury, we're going to put in B. I do think Fury's a little bit worse than Arms currently. However, they are pretty interchangeable as well. You could probably swap them around. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. Fury's niche is more sustained single target or a bigger AoE niche. It doesn't do that cleave damage that I think put Arms up in A here. It's also pretty low on some bosses as well as Arms, and they do just the same damage. I think that Arms niche is just better, so Fury just doesn't have that strong niche that kind of propels Arms to be in its own spot. So next is Havoc. Now, I really want to put this in B, because Havoc's only good thing is sustained single target with Brand. On tons of bosses that's not performing very well. It's in a 3-way tie for last place on Sludge Fist. It's in a dead last. It's about even with the Warriors on Council. But there's also bosses where it's kind of middle of the pack. Havoc is fine in Raid. It's like middle. The playstyle is not fun. Brand keeping up is just a long process of just hitting the thing, and if you go away from the boss, you get very punished. But because it is the best way to bring Chaos Magic, the Brand debuff, I'm going to put it in A, reluctantly. I don't think its damage is all that crazy. It can do some decent enough perma to target cleave, but even then, there's classes that do that better. Its niche is just sustain single target, and it's not even that strong in that niche. But it's just, you're so tanky. You bring the magic debuff, and you bring it better than Vengeance does. So, A tier you are. All right, beep boop. Survival, not survival. Sorry, Outlaw. Outlaw is S tier. Outlaw brings giga single target damage. It's part of the reason why it's so crazy in M+ right now. It also brings the ability to cleave that single target damage to up to 4 other targets at almost no loss with Blade Flurry, and it can just do that almost permanently. I'm pretty sure with any significant like gear level, you can have it up permanently because it is reduced by Restless Blades or Relentless Blades. I don't really know what the name of it is. So, Outlaw, S tier, Giga Strong. Rogues are very survivable. Outlaw has extra range, which helps with some mechanics where you're forced out of range. It has really strong mobility with hook and sprint and just the passive speed increase rogues get. Outlaw, good. Moving on. Ret, I'm going to put in B. Ret has strong single target if you spec into it, but again, it falls into kind of your Enhancement Shaman issue where it's kind of inflexible and locked into that niche. It's also not very survivable. It's very squishy. It has Bubble, but outside of Bubble, Shield of Vengeance is not a very good cooldown, and that's basically all they get. If you need the aura, the 3% damage reduction aura, then Ret is a fine way to bring it. Prot or Holy can also bring it. Ideally, you want a Holy Paladin for Diva aura using Aura Mastery. But Ret can bring that. Ret has a fairly decent stun if needed on bosses with ads. Single target's there. It's fairly good, but because of its inflexibility, I think B tier is fair. Next is Ass. Ass can put down in D. Again, you know, Ass is just not tuned very well currently, and a lot of good rogues are playing Outlaw, which is kind of putting that value up in S tier. Sorry, not putting that value up towards Outlaw and down away from Ass. Ass is fine. The fact that it is bleed-centric means that it can't really cleave onto ads that die fairly quick, especially with a lot of the burst of other classes currently. And really, you know, it's just, its niche isn't very good, so down in D tier it goes. Sub. Sub I'm going to put in C. Sub has some strong funnel, which is actually fairly important on a lot of bosses. You are going to get other ads that spawn with the new affix, the seasonal affix for raids, the faded affix, which they can use to send into bosses. But other than that, I think you're just better off playing Outlaw. Its damage isn't really there in those scenarios where you can't do that. It is the same with Havoc, tied for last on Sludge Fist. And there's definitely some scenarios where it can be popping off and doing good damage, but I don't think it is worthy enough to be in the higher tiers. Survival. So Survival I think originally would be an A, but with the most recent buffs, I think Survival goes in S very easy. They've Giga buffed Survival single target in response to these bomb nerfs, and I think that with how good bomb will probably still be, combined with the fact that they've just buffed their every other ability, I'm pretty sure. Serpent Sting, Raptor Strike, Kill Command, I think they've buffed everything. Means that they're going to be a very strong spec for Burst Cleave or for single target in Raid. I think they're just going to be really good. Unholy is going to go up in A tier. I think Unholy brings really strong Execute, of course. They bring very strong single target damage and burst with Army. The fact that most Unholies will have Gavel now and can use the Gavel to proc their tier set during Army, it's going to be very strong. Likewise, they're also very good to have for dealing with a lot of the other faded affixes. They can grip in the emitter. They can do pretty strong AoE for all the little orbs that spawn. They break the shield fairly well. They bring AMZ. They're very survivable. I think their niche is just better than Frost in that more single target niche with big armies and stuff like that. So I think they deserve to be up in A tier. And last, Windwalker. I think Windwalker is one of the better ones in A tier. Their buffs to single target recently kind of gave them that ability to do the single target damage, as well as having their strong AoE burst if you need it with Mark of the Crane, Spirit of the Crane, stuff like that. They bring Monk debuff, which is very good. You need somebody to bring Monk debuff. They're very survivable, and you know you can never really go wrong with a Windwalker currently because of that single target damage and that ability to do AoE. So those are my thoughts for M+ and Raid. I will have the ranged one out soon. I know I should have had them last week. I've been very busy, and I apologize for that. But leave a comment down below if you agree with me, disagree with me. Let me know what you think. Leave a like. Please consider subscribing. We just hit 400 subs last week, and I'm on a push to hit 500 before Dragonflight comes out, and if I do, I'll be doing a giveaway. So if you like what you see, please consider subscribing. It really helps me out, and thank you for watching. Have a good day.